Welcome back. This show is all about past lives. Have we lived before? And if so, can we recall memories from those past lives? So far, we've seen actress and musician Toyah Wilcox undergo a process of regression where it would seem that she recalled a past life where she was an anchoress over 600 years ago.
No one comes into the room. People can talk to me through the window, which is just above my head. They come and they tell me their secrets.
Where could all this detail and imagery come from? Was Toyah really recalling something from her past, or was she just drawing it all from her imagination? There are many arguments both for and against the idea that we've all lived before. In the end, it always comes back to what you believe.
Very often what you'll find when you look at the actual narratives that people come out with during these past life regressions is that they've borrowed the plot line from some film that's been on recently or some book that they've read, and they've based their own narrative upon that, possibly without even realising that's what they were doing. But sometimes it can be very obvious to the outside observer that that's exactly what they're doing.
There is an approach to acting called the method procedure by which you recall highly emotive events from your past life that will lock into the character and situation that you're playing. Now, performers are quite capable of doing this when they are acting in a film. They're also quite capable of doing it in the role-playing exercise that is past life regression.
Sometimes you'll find the facts they talk about in their past lives do turn out to be true. Mostly, though, it's something they've read about, something they've seen in a film, something they've seen on television. Now, I'm not saying that they're deliberately lying, they're not deliberately falsifying, but very often we see something and we forget that we've actually seen it. And there have been numerous examples when people have looked at these so-called sort of past life regressions where they have actually seen something, perhaps when they were very young, and it's come back into their mind in this hypnotic state.
Time now to investigate the details of Toyah's regression. In a moment, we'll be asking her how she feels about the whole experience. But first, our academic sleuth, historian and archaeologist Jules Hudson will reveal the results of his investigation. Has he been able to track down Toyah's anchoress?
Toyah's story is an extraordinary one. The life she describes is hard to imagine by today's standards. Most of us have never even heard of an anchoress, but once upon a time they were so common in medieval Britain that every town or city had one. But what do we know about these strange, solitary figures who lock themselves away from society? Can we find the anchoress Naomi that Toyah describes? Emerging from the regression are some fascinating results.
I'm an anchoress. I will die in this room.
The anchoress would indeed have lived out her days in a small cell attached to a church, often sited within the cemetery. It was believed once the anchoress entered the cell, she was dead to the outside world. She was destined to live somewhere between the living and the dead on a spiritual level. Not only this, but often a ceremony was performed to seal the anchoress in her cell and to read her the last rites. It was effectively the end of her life as a mortal woman. The anchoress was respected by society and embraced by the church, and as well as attracting visitors, they'd also bring in good hard cash into the parish coffers. But what does Toyah's regression actually tell us about the day-to-day life of an anchoress?
I'm enclosed inside a dark room. I can see very, very little light.
Are there any windows in the room?
Very small.
In Toyah's description, she's very clear about being in a very, very small, dark cell, and it's the small window that she makes big reference to. But here in York, in this reconstruction, it's quite light and airy. But that doesn't mean, of course, there weren't exceptions to the rule, both in Britain and in Europe. And we certainly know from this rule book written by an anchoress back in the 13th century that there were strict codes of how anchoresses should live and how their rooms should be laid out. Key to them were that there were 3 major windows. 2 that looked out into the graveyard and 1 that looked into the church. Of those 3 windows, 1 had a very, very practical purpose. It was to allow food and other bits and pieces to be passed into the anchoress and for her waste to be passed out. And we even get some mention of it in the rulebook. It says here, "Filth was never dear to God, although poverty and plainness of dress are pleasing to him." It was pretty basic, and contact with the outside world was extremely limited.
No one comes into the room. People can talk to me through the window, which is just above my head. They come and they tell me their secrets.
Toyah's description isn't all bad factually, but there was one further window in the cell that was of vital importance. The Anchoress life was full of sacrifice, so they were provided with a small slit or hole through which they could literally squint at the altar, and it was known as the squint. And it was covered by this thing, known as a modesty door, and that meant that the Anchoress could literally shut herself off from the congregation anytime she liked. Sometimes the squint was built so low onto the ground, there was only one way the Anchoress could get down low enough to see the altar and kneel in prayer, and that was to dig out a hole. But this activity was part of a far more dramatic practice. It's recorded that sometimes Anchoresses would dig their own grave into the floor of the cell. Extraordinary! It was indeed an austere and dedicated life, and from the clues we have so far, Toyah's descriptions are spot on. But, and this is a really large but, there's one point in Toyah's story that she's absolutely adamant about, and for me, that calls the whole thing into question. She says that Naomi was held here against her will. And after all, these people weren't nuns who took sacred vows, they were all supposed to be volunteers.
My mother had no choice and I had no choice.
There was one more detail in Toyah's regression that held the key.
And where in the world are you?
Holland.
This is the detail that makes all the difference. When I started looking into the history of the Anchoress in Holland, I suddenly discovered that things were very different. Back in the 14th century in Holland and in Germany, there was a group of women known as the Beguines. This close-knit group of women lived together in a religious community, and they would always have an Anchoress. But the important point was that the position was always allocated by the group. One woman was selected or chosen to be the Anchoress, and when she died, they chose another, and so on. So it wasn't always the case that the Anchoress volunteered. But here we have evidence that women were sometimes given the position, whether they chose it or not. Could this be the clue that unlocks the truth behind Toyah's story? This is where it suddenly all falls into place. Perhaps Naomi didn't choose to be an Anchoress because she was going to inherit the role. She even hinted at this in her regression.
I just knew that I was never being groomed to be a mother, because it was intended I'd follow the last Anchoress.
So if she did exist, is it possible that Toyah's Naomi was a Dutch Beguine destined to become the group's Anchoress? From the research, it seems unlikely that they would have forced somebody into the job, but you never know. What is certainly true is that Toyah's regression revealed some fantastically accurate details about her life as an Anchoress, but of course they were very particular to the place that she lived. Whether Naomi existed, of course, we'll never know, but it has been a fascinating insight into a long-forgotten piece of history.
Now, you threw me a couple of glances during that tape there. What are your thoughts now?
Well, we did the regression a while ago and I let go of it. I didn't think of it. I just thought, you know, is this suggestion? Is this something that I've learnt about? But when he said about the organisation of women, I thought that's it. That's the oppression, because I remember clearly now from being regressed, there was a very oppressive feeling. There was no presence of men, which feels really weird to be sitting here and just, yes, of course, that's it. That was my missing link. It was women. It was women who decided to put me in there.
But you hadn't thought about it since that day?
No, not at all. What I found remarkable about that piece of detective work was that in England, these women were stimulated and educated. In the cell I saw, there was no stimulation whatsoever. This woman became an animal.
At this point, we should, I think, come clean to everybody who is watching this and show you this. It's 1993. This is a movie called
The Anchoress.
The Anchoress.
And I played the mother of an Anchoress in Holland. Now, I know when I went into the regression, this film was nowhere on my mind. And I played a mother who didn't want her daughter to be the anchoress, and the daughter chose to be an anchoress.
I think if you were watching at home, you would now possibly be saying, oh,
It's a
well,
memory.
I think most people would be saying you have to be dragging it up from maybe research that you did for the part or something that someone has told you.
I don't think that a memory was tapped into. I think something quite surprising came out of my subconscious.
What about this group of Dutch women, the Begin?
I'd never heard of the Begin, and if I did study the anchoress for this film, the Begin never came into my psyche. That was a complete surprise to me.
Toyah, as you sit here now, has that had any impact on your life now?
Yes, I'm even more determined that women must never be seen as weak vessels or second class. I feel I'm a male soul in a female body to learn how hard it is to be a woman. It just makes me even more determined that, you know, women must be seen as equal.
That everything you believed prior to going to that regression has just been reinforced.
It's been reinforced. I'm now going to go out and reinforce it some more.
Have we helped you in any way?
No, you've made it worse.
Yeah, I thought we might have done. Thank you very much indeed. We've obviously heard what Toyah thinks. It's time now to see what our experts made of it all.
Now, occasionally in these past life regressions, people come up with what appears to be very obscure information. So, for example, Toyah claimed that in a past life she was an anchoress, and most people, I think, including myself, wouldn't have necessarily know what that meant. But it turns out that Toyah actually played the role of the mother of an anchoress in a film that she was in. So, again, she would have that information, she would have that knowledge, so we shouldn't be too impressed by the fact that she knew about this kind of rather obscure historical concept.
I think where critics make the mistake of looking at this life back to the past life and making that analogy is the wrong way to look at it. You have to look at the past life forward and see how we've appeared in the present day. And perhaps Toyah's reason for being drawn to the role as their anchoress in the film was because of the cell memory of the past life that she's had.
Toyah, a fiercely independent woman who feels that she might have a man's soul in a woman's body. The anchoress's cell is exact analogy, I believe, for the way she regards her own body, that somehow she's trapped in it.
So, when it comes down to it, there is that $1 million question. What do you believe? Have we been here before?
Yes, I do believe we've been here before and will be here in the future.
Right, Toyah, thank you very much. Join us again next time for another chance to ask that question. Have we been here before?